Those for words alone are enough to stop anyone in their tracks. Medieval relics, the most inexplicable discoveries in history, a phrase that carries the weight of centuries. The dust of forgotten kingdoms, and the silent screams of a world that no longer exists. What if history has been lying to us? Not through grand conspiracies or shadowy organizations, but through absence, through the things that were buried, locked away, or dismissed as too strange to explain. What if the Middle Ages left behind objects so extraordinary, so deeply puzzling, that even the greatest minds of our time cannot fully account for them? This is not a story about fantasy. This is not a tale of dragons or sorcerers. This is something far more unsettling. It is the story of real objects, discovered in real places, by help that simply should not exist. And at the center of it all, we follow one man, Dr. Elliot Marsh, a forensic historian working out of a quiet university in Boston, Massachusetts, a man who built his career on the certainty that every mystery has a rational answer, and who, over the course of 3 extraordinary years, had every one of those certainties shattered beyond repair. Elliot was 43 years old when the first relic arrived at his office. He had spent 2 decades studying the material culture of medieval England, the tools, the manuscripts, the coins, the bones. He believed, with the deep and unshakable confidence of a man who had never been seriously wrong, that history was a puzzle with all the pieces already on the table. You just had to arrange them correctly. He had a framed quote on his office wall, a line from a philosopher he admired. The past is not mysterious. The past is merely incomplete. He had believed that for 20 years. He would not believe it much longer. It was a Tuesday morning in late October when the package arrived. No return address. Postmarked from a small town in rural England, a village called Thornwick, in the county of Yorkshire. Inside the package was a single object wrapped in aged linen, and a handwritten note that read, "Dr. Marsh, I found this beneath the floor of a church that no longer exists. I don't know what it is. I don't know why I'm sending it to you, but I think you need to see it." The note was signed only with initials. RW. The object itself was a small disc, roughly the size of a modern silver dollar, made of a metal that Elliot could not immediately identify. It was engraved on both sides, with a pattern of extraordinary complexity, geometric lines that intersected in ways that seemed almost mathematically deliberate, surrounding a central image that appeared to depict a mechanical device of some kind, gears, interlocking circles. A diagram that, to Elliot's trained eye, resembled nothing so much as the internal mechanism of a clock. A sophisticated, precision-engineered clock. And the disc, according to the note, had been found beneath the foundation stones of a church that carbon dating would later confirm had been constructed in the year 1087. Clocks, mechanical clocks of any real sophistication, did not exist in England in 1087, the first recorded mechanical clock in England appeared nearly 2 centuries later. And yet here, in Elliot's hands, was what appeared to be a detailed technical diagram of exactly such a device, etched into metal by hands that lived and worked and died before the technology depicted should have existed. Elliot sat at his desk for a very long time that morning. He turned the disc over and over in his hands. He told himself there was an explanation. There was always an explanation. He just needed to find it. He would spend the next 3 years looking. Check if you're already subscribed to this channel, because what you're about to hear is the kind of story that doesn't just change how you see history. It changes how you see everything. New stories, like this one, drop every week, and you won't want to miss a single one. Subscribe now, and make sure the bell is turned on. The first person Elliot called was Dr. Patricia Vance, a metallurgist at MIT who had been a friend and occasional collaborator for years. He sent her high-resolution photographs of the disc along with a basic description of its provenance. Her response came back within 48 hours. and it was not the reassuring message he had been hoping for. The metal composition, she wrote, was unusual, an alloy whose precise formula she could not immediately match to any known medieval European metalworking tradition. It contained trace elements consistent with deliberate, controlled production rather than the more variable compositions typical of medieval foundry work. "It looks," she wrote, and Elliot could almost hear her careful, scientific reluctance in every word. Like it was made by someone who really knew what they were doing. That phrase lodged itself in Elliot's mind like a splinter. Someone who really knew what they were doing. He began to research the provenance more carefully. He traced the postmark back to Thornwick and made contact with the local historical society, a small volunteer organization run by a retired schoolteacher named Margaret Hollis. Margaret had known R.W. She told Elliot, in a long and somewhat rambling phone call, that the initials stood for Robert Whitfield, a local farmer who had been renovating an old stone outbuilding on his property when he discovered a sealed, underground chamber beneath what had once been a medieval chapel. Robert, she said, had passed away 6 weeks before Elliot received the package. He had mailed it from his hospital bed. The chamber, Margaret said, had since been filled in. Robert's family had found the whole business unsettling and had wanted nothing more to do with it. But before it was filled in, Margaret had taken photographs. She emailed them to Elliot, and he opened them at his desk on a grey November afternoon with a cup of coffee growing cold at his elbow. The photographs showed a stone chamber roughly 8 feet square, with walls of carefully cut and fitted limestone. On 3 of the 4 walls, someone had carved inscriptions, long, dense passages of text. The script was medieval Latin, but the content, as Elliot worked through a rough translation, was deeply strange. The inscriptions appeared to be technical instructions, measurements, ratios, descriptions of mechanical processes. One passage, near the bottom of the eastern wall, seemed to describe a method for calculating the position of celestial bodies with a precision that would not have been formally codified in Western European science for another 400 years. Elliot put his coffee down. He read the passage again, then again. He pulled out 3 different reference books and checked his translation against them. He was not wrong. He knew he was not wrong. He sat back in his chair and stared at the ceiling of his small, book-crowded office, and for the first time in 20 years of professional life, he felt the floor shift beneath him. Not literally, but the feeling was close enough to make him grip the arms of his chair. He called Patricia again. "I need you to come to Boston," he said. "And I need you to bring someone who knows medieval Latin better than I do." She brought Dr. James Okoro, a classicist from Yale, whose specialty was the transmission of scientific knowledge between medieval Islamic scholars and European academics. James arrived on a Thursday afternoon and spent for hours in Elliot's office going through the photographs of the chamber inscriptions, cross-referencing them against a database of known medieval manuscripts on his laptop, asking Elliot occasional questions in a tone of concentrated calm that Elliot found both reassuring and vaguely ominous. At the end of 4 hours, James closed his laptop, took off his glasses, and said, "The Latin is authentic. The vocabulary, the grammatical structures, the abbreviations, all consistent with an educated writer working in England somewhere between 1050 and 1150. That's not the problem. What's the problem?" Elliot asked, though he suspected he already knew. "The problem," James said, "is the content. Because the content isn't consistent with anything that should have been written in England between 1050 and 1150. Some of this material, the astronomical calculations, in particular, shows a level of mathematical sophistication that, as far as I know, did not exist in Western Europe at that time. Now, there are precedents for this kind of thing. The transmission of Islamic scientific texts into medieval Europe happened earlier, and more extensively than people generally realize. It's possible It's possible that someone had access to source material that hasn't survived. But even allowing for that, he trailed off and put his glasses back on and looked at Elliot with an expression that was almost apologetic. Even allowing for that, some of this is hard to explain. The three of them sat in silence for a moment. Outside the window, the November sky was the color of old pewter, and the campus below was nearly empty in the late afternoon chill. Elliot thought about the quote on his wall. The past is not mysterious. The past is merely incomplete. He thought about Robert Whitfield mailing a package from a hospital bed. He thought about a stone chamber sealed beneath a field in Yorkshire, its walls covered in things that should not have been written there. We need to go to England, he said. The decision to travel was not made lightly. Elliot had commitments, a graduate seminar, a book chapter due in December, a department meeting he was supposed to chair. He postponed all of it. Patricia could not get away immediately, but James agreed to come. And the two of them flew to London on a grey December morning and drove north to Yorkshire in a rented car that James, who had grown up in Lagos and spent most of his adult life in American cities, navigated with an expression of focused concentration that Elliot found quietly amusing. Thornwick was a village of perhaps 300 people, arranged along a single main street with a pub, a post office, a church, and a scattering of stone houses that looked as though they had been standing since the Tudors. Margaret Hollis met them at the pub, a small, sharp-eyed woman in her 70s, who shook their hands with the brisk efficiency of a former teacher and immediately ordered them tea, without asking whether they wanted any. She had more photographs, taken before the chamber was sealed. And she had something else, as well, a fragment of stone that Robert Whitfield had brought out of the chamber before his family closed it, a piece of the eastern wall, broken free, at some point, on which several lines of the inscription were clearly visible. James examined it for a long time without speaking. Elliot watched him. The pub was warm and smelled of wood smoke and old upholstery, and the few other customers paid them no particular attention. Finally, James looked up. The carving technique, he said slowly, it's unusual. The depth of the cuts, the way the letters are formed, it's not the work of a professional stonemason doing decorative inscription. It's more deliberate than that. Morikarefu. Like someone who understood that what they were writing needed to survive. Someone who was trying to leave a record, Elliot said. Yes, exactly that. They visited the field the following morning. Robert Whitfield's son, a taciturn man in his early 50s named David, met them at the property boundary and made it clear, with the polite but unmistakable firmness of a man who had made up his mind, that he had no interest in reopening the chamber and no intention of discussing it further. His father, he said, had become obsessed with the thing in the last months of his life. It had not been good for him. Whatever was down there, David Whitfield wanted it to stay there. Elliot did not push. He understood on a human level the desire to close a door and walk away. He thanked David, and he and James stood in the field for a while in the cold December air, looking at the frost-hardened ground, knowing that somewhere beneath their feet a stone room sat in the dark with its impossible words on the walls. On the drive back to London, James was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "You know what bothers me most? It's not the technical content. It's the fact that whoever wrote it went to the trouble of sealing it, building a chamber, cutting it into stone. They wanted it hidden, but they also wanted it preserved. They wanted someone to find it eventually. They were writing for the future." He paused. "That's a very particular kind of mind. Someone who believed that what they knew was too important to lose, but also too dangerous, or too implausible, to share openly." Elliot thought about that all the way back to London. He thought about it on the flight home. He thought about a person, a real person, a human being with a body and a name and a life, sitting in a stone chamber in 11th century England, carving knowledge into walls by candlelight, writing for someone who would not arrive for 1,000 years. The second relic appeared for months later, and this time Elliot did not have to wait for it to come to him. A colleague at the Smithsonian, Dr. Sandra Reyes, a curator in the medieval European collection, sent him an email with a subject line that read simply, "You need to see this." The object in question had been in the Smithsonian storage archives for over 60 years. Acquired in 1962 as part of a collection donated by the estate of an American collector who had purchased it at auction. In London in the 1940s. It had been catalogued, labeled, and filed away as a decorative pendant of unknown origin. Estimated date 14th century, and largely forgotten. Sandra had come across it while conducting a routine inventory of the storage archives. Something about it had caught her eye, a quality of workmanship that seemed inconsistent with the catalog description. She had pulled it out, examined it more carefully, and then called Elliot. "I've been doing this job for 18 years, she told him on the phone, "and I have never seen anything quite like it." The pendant was slightly larger than the Yorkshire disc, oval, about 3 long and majava, a dark metal that initial analysis suggested was a form of hardened iron with a surface treatment that had not yet been fully characterized. But it was the engraving that had caught Sandra's attention, and when Elliot arrived at the Smithsonian 2 days later and looked at it under magnification for the first time, he understood immediately why. The surface of the pendant was covered in an extraordinarily fine engraving, lines so thin and so precisely rendered that a magnifying glass was required to see them clearly. The image depicted was a map, not a symbolic or decorative representation of geography in the medieval style, not the kind of circular, Jerusalem-centered world map that educated Europeans of the Middle Ages would have recognized, but something that looked, with an almost shocking degree of accuracy, like a coastline. A specific, identifiable coastline, the eastern seaboard of North America. Elliot stared at it for a very long time. He was aware, somewhere in the background of his consciousness, of the distant sounds of the museum, the murmur of visitors, the soft footsteps of staff. He was aware of Sandra standing beside him, watching his face. He was aware of the weight of the pendant in his hand, surprisingly heavy for its size. And he was aware, with a clarity that was almost physical, of the ground shifting beneath him again. "The dating," he said finally. "What's the dating?" "Preliminary thermoluminescence on some surface material suggests somewhere between 1200 and 1350. Sandra sighed. "We need more precise analysis, and I've already submitted samples. But that's the initial range. Between 1200 and 1350, Columbus sailed in 1492. The first documented European contact with the eastern coast of North America by Norse explorers had occurred around the year 1000 and had left no known cartographic legacy in mainstream European scholarship of the following centuries. And yet here was a pendant, apparently produced in medieval Europe no later than the mid-14th century, bearing what appeared to be a remarkably accurate depiction of a coastline that, according to the conventional historical record, was not known to European mapmakers until the late 15th century at the earliest. If the pendant was genuine, if it was what it appeared to be, Elliot made himself breathe carefully and think carefully. He had been in this field long enough to know that appearances were not conclusions. Objects could be misidentified. Dating methods had margins of error. Maps could be abstract, coincidental, misinterpreted. The history of medieval studies was littered with sensational claims that had collapsed under scrutiny. He was not going to be the man who saw what he wanted to see and stopped asking questions. But he was also not going to be the man who looked away. He spent 3 days at the Smithsonian, working with Sandra and 2 additional specialists. She had brought in a cartographer from Johns Hopkins and a materials scientist from Georgetown. By the end of those 3 days, the picture had not become simpler. The materials analysis confirmed that the pendant had not been manufactured recently or even within the last century. The surface, oxidation patterns, and the crystalline structure of the metal were consistent with genuine extreme age. The cartographer, a careful and conservative scholar named Dr. Mei-Lin Chan, spent an entire afternoon with the pendant and its magnified images, and then delivered her assessment in a calm, measured voice that did not entirely conceal her agitation. The coastline, she said, showed features that were specifically consistent with actual geographic landmarks on the eastern coast of North America. Not a vague resemblance. Specific correspondence, including a feature she identified as the distinctive shape of Chesapeake Bay. "I want to be careful here," Mei-Lin said, looking around at all of them. "I want to be very careful. There are alternative explanations. The resemblance could be coincidental. The object could have been modified or reworked at a later date. The dating could be wrong. I am not telling you this is a 14th century map of North America. I am telling you that I cannot, at this moment, definitively rule it out. And that is not a comfortable place to be." No one in the room said anything for a moment. Then Elliot said, quietly, "No, it isn't. That night." Back in his hotel room near the mall, Elliot called Patricia Vance. He told her about the pendant. He told her about the cartographer's assessment. He told her about the Yorkshire disc and the chamber inscriptions and Robert Whitfield mailing a package from a hospital bed. He laid it all out, piece by piece, in the dark hotel room with the city lights coming through the curtains. And when he was finished, Patricia was quiet for so long that he thought the call had dropped. Then she said, "Elliot, what if it isn't a coincidence? What if these things are connected?" He had been thinking the same thing. Leave a comment below telling us what you think the most inexplicable discovery from the Middle Ages is. We read every single one. The connection, when it emerged, came not from the objects themselves but from the documents. Elliot returned to Boston with copies of every analysis, every photograph, every note, and began the slow, obsessive work of searching for a thread. He expanded his research beyond the 2 objects he had directly examined and began systematically cataloging every known case of anomalous medieval artifacts. Objects that had been studied, dated, and then quietly set aside because their implications were too uncomfortable to pursue. He had known, in a general way, that such cases existed. Every field of scholarship had its inconvenient data points, its outliers, its objects that didn't fit neatly into the accepted narrative. He had always assumed they were aberrations, individual anomalies. Now, working methodically through the literature in a way he had never done before, with the specific question of connection in mind, rather than the general question of classification, he began to see something different. He began to see a pattern. It was not a large pattern. It was not a dramatic one. It did not announce itself with flashing lights or obvious signposts. It was the kind of pattern that only becomes visible when you have spent enough time looking, a quiet accumulation of small consistencies that, taken individually, mean nothing, but taken together suggest something that the rational mind resists acknowledging. Over a period of roughly 3 months, working late into most nights and spending weekends in the university library, Elliot identified 11 objects in various museum collections and academic archives across England, France, Germany, and the United States that shared certain characteristics. They were all medieval in date, ranging from the 11th to the 14th centuries. They were all made of unusual metal alloys, whose precise compositions did not match standard medieval European metalworking. They were all engraved with complex imagery, technical diagrams, maps, astronomical charts, geometric patterns of unusual mathematical sophistication. And they had all, at some point in their histories, been in private collections before being acquired by institutions, meaning their precise archaeological context had often been lost or obscured. 11 objects, scattered across 4 countries, spanning 3 centuries. And there was one more thing. 7 of the 11 objects bore, somewhere in their engraving, a small symbolistic mark that appeared in slightly varying forms, but was always recognizably the same design. 2 interlocking circles with a vertical line passing through their intersection. Elliot had not noticed it on the Yorkshire disc at first. It was tiny, almost invisible, tucked into the corner of the complex geometric pattern. But once he knew to look for it, he found it. It was there. And it was on 6 other objects spread across half a millennium and half a continent. The symbol meant something. Someone had put it there deliberately, as a kind of signature or mark. And whoever that someone was, they, or the tradition they represented, had been producing these objects across a span of at least 200 years. A continuous effort. A sustained project. An attempt carried out over generations. To record and preserve a body of knowledge that those involved clearly believed needed to be hidden, but also needed to survive. Elliot sat in his office late on a Friday night in April, surrounded by photographs and printouts and the organized debris of 3 months of research. And he thought about what that meant. Not the knowledge itself, not yet, but the people. The human beings who had committed themselves, generation after generation, to the maintenance of a secret that they knew they would not live to see resolved. Who had trusted objects, small, durable, concealable objects, to carry their message forward through centuries to eyes they would never meet. He thought about what it required to do that, the discipline, the faith, the profound, unshakable conviction that what you knew was worth preserving at any cost. He thought about the inscription on the eastern wall of the Yorkshire chamber, about the person who had carved it, about the candlelight they must have worked by, in a sealed stone room, in a country that would not understand what they were writing for 400 years. He picked up his phone and called Patricia. "I found the thread," he said. The 4th relic, the one that changed everything, surfaced not in an archive or a museum, but in the most unlikely of places. A storage unit in Newark, New Jersey, being cleared out after the death of an elderly man named Giorgio Ferretti, a retired stonemason who had emigrated from northern Italy to the United States in 1971 and had worked quietly in the construction trade for 30 years before retiring. Giorgio had no children. His nearest relative was a niece, a young woman named Clara, who lived in Philadelphia and who had driven to Newark on a cold morning in February to sort through her great-uncle's belongings, which she expected to consist largely of old tools, immigration documents, and the accumulated domestic debris of a long and solitary life. What she found, in a locked metal box at the back of the storage unit, was a collection of 12 objects wrapped individually in oilcloth. Each one was a small metal disc or pendant, engraved with complex imagery. Each one bore somewhere, in its design, to interlocking circles with a vertical line passing through their intersection. Clara had never heard of Elliot Marsh. She had no particular interest in medieval history. But she had a friend who was a graduate student in art history at Columbia, and she sent her friend photographs of the objects, and the friend sent them to her advisor, and the advisor sent them to a colleague in medieval studies. And 3 weeks later, Elliot received an email from someone he had never met, with 12 photograph attachments and a subject line that read, "I think these might be relevant to your research." He opened the email on a Tuesday morning. He looked at the photographs. He counted the interlocking circle symbols on each object. All 12 bore it. He looked at the engraved imagery, which was complex and varied and which, even in the photographs, showed a quality of workmanship that he was already beginning to recognize as characteristic. He read the email twice. Then he put his head in his hands for a moment, not in distress exactly. but in the particular kind of overwhelm that comes when a puzzle that you have been working on for 3 years suddenly presents you with 12 new pieces all at once. He wrote back within the hour. Clara Ferretti was 26 years old, clear-eyed and pragmatic, and she met Elliot at a coffee shop in Philadelphia 2 weeks later with the 12 objects in a canvas bag and an expression that combined wariness with genuine curiosity. She had done some research in the intervening weeks and knew enough about Elliot's work to understand that her great-uncle's collection was significant. What she didn't understand was why Giorgio had had them. Giorgio had been, by all accounts, an ordinary monk, hard-working, private, not particularly educated in any formal sense. He had talked about his home region of northern Italy with affection but not obsession. He had attended church regularly. He had played cards on Friday evenings with other Italian immigrants. He had not, as far as Clara knew, had any scholarly interest in medieval history. But he had kept these objects in a locked box for 40 years. And he had never mentioned them to anyone. Did he ever talk about where they came from? Elliot asked. Clara shook her head. He didn't talk much about the past. He was that kind of person. Private? She paused. But I found something else in the box. Under the objects, she reached into the canvas bag and produced a small envelope, old and soft with age, sealed with wax. I haven't opened it, she said. It didn't feel like mine to open. Elliot looked at the envelope. On the front, in a neat, careful handwriting, were 2 words. They were in English, which seemed slightly odd given that Giorgio had been Italian. They read, "For whoever finds these after me." He looked up at Clara. She nodded. He opened the envelope. Inside was a single folded sheet of paper, handwritten in the same neat hand. The letter was dated 1968, 3 years before Giorgio emigrated to the United States, and it was addressed to no one in particular. It was written in a mix of Italian and English, as though the writer had started in one language and shifted to the other as the letter progressed. Perhaps seeking precision, perhaps reaching toward a future reader who might not know Italian. Elliot read it slowly, translating the Italian portions as he went, aware of Clara watching his face. The letter said, in essence, these objects had been in Giorgio's family for as long as anyone could remember. They had been passed down, generation to generation, with a single instruction: keep them safe, keep them hidden, and when the time comes, pass them on. For most of Giorgio's ancestors, the time had never come. They had simply passed the objects to their children and the responsibility with them. But Giorgio was the last. He had no children. He could not pass them on in the traditional way. And he had spent the last several years wondering what to do. He had concluded that the right thing, the thing that honored the responsibility he had inherited, was to ensure that the objects eventually reached someone who would understand them. He did not know who that would be. He could only trust that they would find their way. He ended the letter with a sentence that Elliot read 3 times in the coffee shop and would read many more times afterward. I do not know what these things mean. I only know that they matter. I know this, the way you know anything that has been trusted to you by people who are no longer here to explain why. You feel the weight of it. You carry it. And you hope. Elliot folded the letter carefully and put it back in the envelope. He was quiet for a moment. Outside the coffee shop window, Philadelphia moved past in the gray February light, people and cars, and the ordinary texture of a modern American city. He thought about Giorgio Ferretti in a storage unit in Newark, locking a metal box and trusting to chance or fate or the simple arithmetic of human connection that it would eventually reach the right hands. He thought about generations of people before Giorgio in villages in northern Italy, doing the same thing, passing a box of metal objects to their children and saying, keep these safe. We don't know why, but keep them safe. He thought about a person carving words into stone in a sealed chamber in Yorkshire in the 11th century, writing for someone who would not arrive for 1,000 years. "I'll take care of them," he said to Clara. He meant it. If you've made it this far, and you're still watching, drop a comment right now. Say "I carried it," because that's what every person in this story did. They carried something they didn't fully understand, and they trusted the future with it. If this story moved you, even a little, say those 3 words. I want to know you're out there. The analysis of Giorgio's 12 objects took 8 months. Elliot assembled the most careful, most rigorous team he could. Patricia Vance for the metallurgical work, James Okoro for the textual and historical analysis, Mei Lin Chun for the cartographic elements. 2 additional specialists, Dr. Raj Okafor, an expert in Islamic medieval science from Princeton, and Dr. Anna Kowalski, a specialist in medieval European trade networks from the University of Chicago. He did not announce what he was doing. He did not publish preliminary findings or give interviews. He worked quietly, methodically, in the way that he had been trained, the way that 20 years of careful scholarship had shaped him to work. What the team found over those 8 months was this: the 12 objects from Giorgio's collection, taken together with the Yorkshire disc and the Smithsonian pendant, constituted what appeared to be a fragmentary but coherent body of recorded knowledge. The individual objects, examined in isolation, had seemed to show disconnected elements, a mechanical diagram here, an astronomical calculation there, a map fragment in another place. But when arranged according to the dating evidence and cross-referenced against each other, and against the Yemen chamber inscriptions, a larger picture began to emerge. It was incomplete. There were clearly objects missing, gaps in the sequence, places where the logic jumped in ways that suggested intervening pieces that had not survived or had not yet been found. But the overall structure was discernible. It was, Rashid concluded after months of painstaking analysis, a record of knowledge transmission. Specifically, it appeared to document the movement of scientific and mathematical knowledge from Islamic scholars in the Middle East and Iberian Peninsula into Western Europe during the 11th, 12th, and 13th centuries, a process that historians already knew had occurred and that had been foundational to what later became the European Renaissance. What was not known, what no historical record had previously suggested, was that some of this transmission had been organized and deliberate, carried out by a specific network of individuals who had chosen, for reasons that the objects themselves did not fully explain, to record their activities in a form that was designed to be hidden from the mainstream intellectual and religious establishments of their time, but preserved for eventual discovery. Why? Elliot asked Rashid one evening, when the 2 of them were alone in the lab, surrounded by the objects and months of accumulated analysis. Why hide it? Why not just share the knowledge openly? Rashid was quiet for a moment. He was a careful, measured man, not given to dramatic statements. But when he answered, there was something in his voice that Elliot had not heard there before, a kind of sorrow, perhaps, or awe. Because the knowledge was dangerous, he said. Not in the way we think of things as dangerous today. But in that world, in that time, certain kinds of knowledge implied certain kinds of relationships between people and between cultures that the dominant institutions could not accommodate. If you were a scholar in 11th century England who had learned things from Islamic sources, who had been educated, in some meaningful sense, by a tradition that your society officially regarded as an enemy, you could not announce that openly. You would have been destroyed. Not physically, necessarily, but professionally, socially, spiritually. Everything you were would have been taken from you. He paused. So you hid it. You found other people who understood. You built a network that existed in the margins of the visible world, and you trusted the objects to carry your message forward into a future where the conversation could finally happen openly. Elliot stood in the lab for a long time after Rashid said that. He looked at the objects, Laid out on the examination table, 14 pieces of engraved metal, spanning 3 centuries, crossing a continent and an ocean, passing through an untold number of hands. He thought about all the people they had passed through, the carver in the Yorkshire chamber, the craftsman or craftswoman who had made the Smithsonian pendant, the generations of Giorgio's family in northern Italy keeping a locked box and asking no questions. Robert Whitfield mailing a package from a hospital bed. Clara Ferrejo in Newark. All of them, knowingly or unknowingly, part of a chain that stretched back to a world that had been dead for 800 years. He thought about what it meant to carry something you did not fully understand, to honor a responsibility that had been given to you without full explanation, to trust, as Giorgio had put it, the weight of it. And he thought about something else, something that had been at the edge of his mind for months and that he had not yet fully articulated, even to himself. Something that the entire long arc of this investigation had been, in its slow and winding way, pointing toward. History was not a puzzle with all the pieces on the table. It never had been. It was something far more dynamic than that, a living thing, constantly being revised and extended and complicated by discoveries that arrived from unexpected directions, delivered by people who did not know what they were carrying. The past was not fixed. It was not merely incomplete, in the passive sense of a collection with gaps. It was active. It was reaching forward, generation by generation, through the patience and the faith of ordinary people who kept boxes locked and sent packages from hospital beds, toward a present that could finally receive what it was being sent. The framed quote on his office wall had been wrong. Not entirely. There were things about the past that were knowable, reconstructible, rational, but the mystery was real. The mystery was not a failure of evidence or a gap in the record. It was the nature of the thing itself, the nature of knowledge as it moves through time, carried by human hands, hidden when it must be hidden, preserved when it can be preserved, and arriving, finally, when the world is ready to hear it. Eliot published his findings in a peer-reviewed journal 18 months after receiving the letter from Clara Ferretti. The paper was co-authored by all 5 members of his team and ran to 86 pages. It was careful and measured and scrupulously documented, as good scholarship requires. It made no claims that could not be supported by evidence. It acknowledged every uncertainty, every gap, every alternative interpretation. It was, by the standards of academic medieval studies, a landmark paper, the kind that redirects a field. It also made Eliot briefly famous, in a way that he found somewhat bewildering and largely uncomfortable. There were interviews and profiles and invitations to speak at conferences in cities he had never visited. There was a documentary proposal that he declined, and a book offer that he accepted and then spent 2 years writing, trying to do justice to the complexity of what he had found and the people who had been part of finding it. He dedicated the book to Robert Whitfield, who had mailed a package from a hospital bed, and to Giorgio Ferretti, who had locked a box in Newark and trusted the future with it, and to all the unnamed people across 8 centuries who had carried something they did not fully understand and hoped. The final object, the one that Eliot sometimes thought of as the most important of all, though it was in many ways the simplest, was not a disc or a pendant. It was a small piece of parchment, found during the conservation of one of Giorgio's metal objects when the oilcloth wrapping was carefully removed. It had been tucked against the back of the object, protected by the cloth for who knows how many decades, and it bore a single sentence in a clear, unhurried hand. The language was medieval Latin, but the sentiment was so direct and so human that Eliot felt it required no translation. He had Patricia photograph it, and had the photograph framed, and it hung in his office beside the quote he had taken down in the place where the old certainty had been. The sentence read, "If you are reading this, then we were right to trust." He thought about those words often in the years that followed. He thought about them when students came to his office with questions that he could not fully answer. He thought about them when he received letters from people around the world who had read his book and been moved by it in ways they struggled to articulate. He thought about them on the evenings when he sat in his office alone, with the objects in their glass cases and the photographs on the walls, and felt the specific quality of presence that old things carry, the sense of being in contact, however tenuously, with lives that have been fully and completely lived. If you are reading this, then we were right to trust. 1,100 years between the writing and the reading. 1,100 years of hands and boxes and locked rooms and careful wrapping and hope. And at the end of it, a man in a Boston office holding a piece of parchment, understanding that he had been trusted by people he would never meet in a world he could barely imagine to receive what they had sent. He thought it was the most remarkable thing he had ever held. He thought it was the most remarkable thing he had ever known. And he thought with the particular, luminous certainty of a man who has spent his professional life trying to understand the past and has finally, after many years, come to understand something true about it, that the objects would keep coming, that there were more of them out there, in locked boxes and sealed chambers, and archive drawers in institutions that had not yet thought to look carefully at what they held, that the chain was not broken, that the people of the Middle Ages, those extraordinary, complicated, brilliant, and deeply human men and women who had lived and thought and feared and hoped, in a world so different from ours, and yet recognizably the same, had more to say, and that history, real history, the kind that breathes, was still, even now, in the business of arriving. Medieval Relics, the most inexplicable discoveries in history. That is the title of this story. And now you know why. If you watched all the way to the end, and if you did, you are exactly the kind of person this channel exists for. Please take 1 second and hit the subscribe button right now. Every week, this channel brings you stories like this one, real, researched, emotionally honest stories about the past and the people who lived it. You won't want to miss what comes next. Subscribe and turn on notifications. And leave a comment saying I carried it, because if this story moved you, that is what you did. You carried it to the end. I want to know you're here. If this story meant something to you, share it. Send it to someone who loves history, or someone who needs to be reminded that the past is still speaking. And hit the like button. It takes 1 second, and it helps more people find stories like this one. Thank you for being here. Thank you for watching. And thank you for carrying it.